Gun control votes. Lawmakers split on the issue following the Orlando shooting rampage. Conversations with a killer. What the Orlando gunman said during the attack. Prayers and push for peace. Pope Francis reaches out to leaders of the Middle East. Staff shakeup. How Donald Trump's presidential campaign is changing. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Monday, June 20th, 2016. Good evening from Washington. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. Tonight, in the wake of the worst mass shooting in recent U.S. history, the U.S. Senate votes on 4 gun control proposals. Jason Calvi is covering that debate on Capitol Hill. Jason?
Brian, the Senate is voting on 2 Democratic and 2 Republican proposals. Each side has their own plans for background checks and for keeping guns out of the hands of terrorists. But all 4 are likely to fail tonight, not reaching the necessary 60 votes.
Looks like a gun control stalemate. California Democrat Dianne Feinstein's proposal would let the government stop gun sales to people it suspects of being terrorists.
It would cover this latest shooter. It does have a good, strong appeal process.
But the number 2 Republican Senator John Cornyn tells News Nightly there are serious problems with that.
Anytime you're denying an American citizen their constitutional rights, it ought to be with evidence. I think that's a dangerous, slippery slope. And I think what we need to do is make sure that we deny terrorist guns, which my bill does, that we do so consistent with the Constitution.
The influential NRA backs Cornyn's proposal, which is also up for a vote tonight. It lets the government delay a gun sale to a suspected terrorist for 72 hours. A court order is needed to then block the sale permanently.
It helps solve the problem. It notifies the FBI immediately.
But Democrats say Cornyn's plan isn't tough enough.
It says that if the FBI thinks you're a terrorist, they have 3 days to go to court and get an adjudication, and if not, you can get a gun. Every terrorist will get a gun. If the FBI had that evidence, they would have arrested the person to begin with. It's a fake.
But Cornyn says it's very real.
It gives them 3 days to get more. They can execute a search warrant. They can get a wiretap, but they're going to have to demonstrate to a court that they've got a basis to do so.
Tonight's votes come after Democratic Senator Chris Murphy's marathon 14-hour, 50-minute filibuster Thursday.
And the Senate will also be voting on dueling background check proposals. The Democratic plan expands background checks, leaving few loopholes, while the Republicans' plan boosts money into the federal background check system. Both plans urge the states to do a better job of sending info to the FBI. Brian?
Thanks, Jason Calvi at the Capitol. And the Supreme Court upholds assault weapon bans in Connecticut and New York, allowing a longer court ruling to stand. That is a lower court ruling. The state lawmakers banned assault weapons following the Newtown school shooting. 7 states and the District of Columbia have enacted laws banning assault weapons. The Supreme Court also announces today it will review an immigration case. Justices will decide whether certain immigrants facing deportation can be held longer than 6 months while waiting for a hearing. The Obama administration says immigrants accused of committing crimes should not receive an automatic bond hearing. But a federal appeals court says holding immigrants indefinitely violates their due process rights. And we're still waiting for the Supreme Court decision on a Texas abortion case. The president of Students for Life of America says the decision could come as early as Thursday, perhaps next Monday. Analyst Amy Howe joins us shortly to explain what's at stake in this case. And other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. A major shakeup in the Donald Trump campaign. Corey Lewandowski is out as campaign manager. Chief White House correspondent and political director Lauren Ashburn reports.
Ryan, Donald Trump had a chance to use his trademark phrase, "You're fired," from his reality show, The Apprentice. It happened after a Monday morning weekly meeting with Trump's family members. Trump has come under intense criticism over an array of issues, and his poll numbers have softened. Corey Lewandowski says he does not know why he was fired, but he has no regrets and no ill will.
I had a nice conversation with Mr. Trump, and I said to him, it's been an honor and a privilege to be part of this, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart.
Lewandowski has long been a controversial figure, especially since March. That's when he was charged with misdemeanor battery for an altercation involving Breitbart reporter Michelle Fields. She accused him of grabbing and bruising her after a news conference. Trump defended Lewandowski and accused Fields of making up the story. Lewandowski tweeted she was totally delusional. The charges were later dropped. In an indication of how his firing is playing out within the campaign, Trump aide Michael Caputo tweeted, "Ding dong, the witch is dead," and included a link to the song from the film The Wizard of Oz. The move came as Trump faced resistance from many quarters of his party. Lewandowski's abrupt departure is the Trump campaign's most significant staff change to date. There is 1 month left until the Republican National Convention in Cleveland. Paul Manafort is expected to be the campaign manager. He's advised Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush. Brian?
All right, Lauren Ashburn at the White House, thank you. And the FBI releases partial police transcripts from the Orlando massacre. They reveal conversations between police and the gunman during the attack. 33 minutes after the first gunshots at the Pulse nightclub, police say a 911 dispatcher heard from the gunman. According to a transcript, Omar Mateen called and said in Arabic, "In the name of God, the merciful, the beneficial." A dispatcher asked, "What?" Mateen continued, "Praise be to God and prayers as well as peace be upon the prophet of God. I let you know I'm in Orlando and I did the shootings."
We currently have no evidence that he was directed by a foreign terrorist group, but was radicalized domestically.
The timeline shows crisis negotiation calls at 2:48, 3:03, and 3:24 a.m. Police say releasing the audio would be too painful for victims, but they describe Mateen's tone.
While the killer made these murderous statements, he did so in a chilling, calm, and deliberate manner.
Calling himself an Islamic soldier, Mateen allegedly said he had bombs and that there would be similar attacks in days to come. Police say the next shots fired came after a SWAT team entered at 5:02 a.m., the first shots in nearly 3 hours of hostage negotiations.
So during that time, our officers were intermittently in and out of that club, saving people.
The Joint Terrorism Task Force says in the past week, it's logged more than 500 interviews, processed more than 600 pieces of evidence, and taken in thousands of tips. They say the investigation may last months, perhaps even years. House Speaker Paul Ryan criticizing the FBI for removing references to ISIS and calls for the release of the entire transcript. He says he wants to be sure the public is clear-eyed about who did this and why. The Justice Department later released a more complete transcript that confirmed Mateen pledged allegiance to the leader of the Islamic State group. 2 high-ranking New York Police Department officials and a sergeant are among those arrested today in a widening city corruption probe. The charges include claims that a top police official roomed with a prostitute during a Las Vegas trip. A major contributor to the election campaign of Democratic Mayor Bill de Blasio already has pleaded guilty in this case. De Blasio himself has not been implicated. And Pope Francis prays for Orthodox leaders meeting on the Greek island of Crete this week. The week-long summit to discuss unity is the first of its kind in more than 1,200 years. It was supposed to include the leaders of all the Orthodox churches, but the Russian Orthodox and 3 other churches pulled out. Former Israeli President Shimon Peres pays a visit to Pope Francis. The Vatican isn't releasing many details about their meeting. They were expected to continue conversations about peace in the Middle East. The Pope hosted Peres and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas for an interfaith peace prayer service 2 years ago in the Vatican Gardens. The Supreme Court issued a series of rulings today. It has only until the end of the month to rule on major remaining cases involving immigration reform and abortion. Supreme Court analyst Amy Howe is editor of SCOTUS Blog. The Supreme Court still has not ruled on the Texas law that requires abortion clinics to meet certain health and safety standards. You were there for the oral arguments. Based on the questions justices asked, what do you expect will happen?
There was a deeply divided court at the oral argument on March 2nd. It was the first major oral argument since Justice Scalia's death on February 13th, and so it was a little bit more subdued than you might have expected on the conservative side. The 4 liberal justices really seemed like they were ready to vote for the challengers to the regulations. It was a little harder to read some of the more conservative justices. And so the sort of 2 things going on right now. The question is, when are we going to get a ruling? And the second question, because there are only 8 justices, will they be able to issue a substantive ruling at all?
And if it ties, though, the law stays in effect.
Well, the law has not gone into effect yet, but the lower courts did uphold the law, yes. And so then at some point, presumably, the law would actually be able to go into effect.
As far as when, it's going to have to happen fairly soon, right?
Yes. I mean, I think the court will probably be in session. They will also issue opinions on at least Thursday of this week, probably on Monday of next week. So definitely sometime, certainly within the next week or 10 days.
Wow, the buzz this weekend, though, is that Clarence Thomas may be considering retiring. Is that credible?
I don't really think there's a lot of credibility to it. And as I understand it, Mrs. Thomas had actually taken to Facebook to denounce the rumors. But I think given the sort of, I don't want to say mess, but given the difficulty that the court is having right now, operating with only 8 justices since the death of Justice Scalia, I really can't imagine, putting everything else aside, that Justice Thomas would voluntarily retire and leave the court with just 7 justices right now, with no prospect of a replacement coming on the court until perhaps sometime early next year.
Is it possible, though, this buzz might fire up conservatives to say, look, we've lost Justice Scalia. Both these guys are Catholics, by the way. If we lose another conservative Catholic judge, we're in trouble. Maybe it would fire up the electorate.
That's very possible, certainly. I mean, I think that certainly the Senate Majority Leader and other Senate Republicans have really tried to keep to stall and not act on the nomination of Chief Judge Merrick Garland. And they've had a lot of success because I think they have a lot of support from conservatives for that position. And certainly this would solidify that thinking going forward.
The future of the court, a huge issue in this election.
It
Amy
is
Howe.
indeed.
Thank you so much, Amy.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up on World Refugee Day, Pope Francis draws attention to the plight of migrants and a preview of a new book about religious freedom. Pope Francis making a surprise visit to retired and sick priests in Rome. It's part of his Mercy Friday initiative, spending time with different groups each month during the Jubilee of Mercy, and he even brought them wine for the celebration. It's important to have wine. Thank you for joining us on this first day of summer, a Monday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. Pope Francis says Christian persecution extends beyond genocide. He told a group of students Saturday that it's actually martyrdom, people dying for their faith. ISIS has been killing Christians in the Middle East and North Africa. The U.S. now recognizes that officially as genocide. The fight against ISIS in Iraq results in a huge number of war refugees. Parents and their children are forced to live in large tents surrounded by trash outside Fallujah. That's where Iraqi troops are still battling ISIS in pockets. The government declared the city's liberation last week. And as the UN marks World Refugee Day, a new report says a record 65 million people were displaced by the end of 2015. These are new, familiar yet dramatic scenes of migrants arriving in Europe on rubber rafts. According to the UN, more than half of refugees in the world come from Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. The UN says Syria is experiencing the largest humanitarian crisis in modern times. There are nearly 5 million refugees in the region, more than 6 million people displaced internally in Syria. Forced migration is an issue important to our Holy Father. Since becoming Pope, Francis has highlighted the plight of refugees and continues to do so. Mary Shovlain reports from Rome.
In his Angelus address yesterday in St. Peter's Square, Pope Francis urges the world to help refugees.
Le loro storie e I loro volti.
He says their faces, their stories, call on us to renew our commitment for building peace through justice. This year's World Day for Refugees is a grim reminder that this crisis is far from over. In Syria, for example, the UN High Commission for Refugees counts 11 million people who have been displaced or lost their lives. Nawar is 7 years old. He is a reminder of the young face of immigration. He left his home in Syria with his family on a journey that would take him to Turkey, Greece, and finally Germany.
I'm happy to be in Germany because there's no war. It was a really hard journey. The most difficult part was sleeping on rocks and climbing up mountains and down mountains, up and down, and on the boat.
His journey is that of many. The church is on the front lines all over the world to welcome them, following Pope Francis's example.
I think this is an enormous task for the church to educate ourselves, to understand ourselves, especially through the attitude and through the words of the Holy Father. We are rejuvenated, or we have to be rejuvenated by the immigration. We have to take out a new, courage and capacity to speak, to act. So it is really a very global, big task.
A task the Holy Father is urgently asking the faithful to take up. In Rome, Mary Shovlain, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Mary. And thousands of refugees never make it to their final destination. Many are detained on their journey to Europe. This family was among the first to settle in Jordan's largest refugee camp after fleeing Syria in 2013. There are now 80,000 people here. Salam is a father of 6. He writes and reads poetry to keep the memory of Syria alive for his children. Salam doesn't expect to return home soon. He hopes his children are educated and they prosper in the refugee camp. The U.S. Bishop's Fortnight for Freedom campaign begins this week. Relics of Saints Thomas More and John Fisher, defenders of religious freedom, tour the U.S. until July 4th. Baltimore Archbishop William Laurie will celebrate the campaign's opening Mass. You'll see it here on EWTN tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Recent laws, court decisions, and the cultural climate pose new threats to religious freedom. The topic is explored in a book being released tomorrow. Political director Lauren Ashburn talks with author Mary Eberstadt.
Mary, thank you so much for joining us. Your book, It's Dangerous to Believe, you said, is talking about the religious witch hunt that is going on in our society. Why do you use that term?
It's a strong term, Lauren, but I do think it suits for several reasons. There is a level of irrationality and discrimination directed against religious believers these days that is really something new in the Western world.
Give me an example of that.
Well, there are numbers of examples in the book of people, for example, who have lost their jobs or been suspended for things like saying a prayer on a football field at the end of a game. There's widespread discrimination and recrimination on social media against religious believers just for being religious believers. People are called bigots and haters and other hurtful names just in virtue of being followers of the cross. And that is something new under the sun.
Are Catholics particularly targeted?
I think it is pretty safe to attack Catholics, so in a sense, yes. For example, Hilary Mantel, who's a well-known novelist, winner of the Booker Prize, England's most prestigious literary prize, said some years ago, quote, "The Catholic Church is not a place for respectable people," unquote. There's a lot of that kind of free-floating aggression against religious believers. And what I'm trying to do with this book is bring attention to it and ask secularists and progressives especially to be open-minded and to extend to religious believers the same kind of courtesy that they want extended to themselves.
How will this play out in the presidential election?
Well, it's interesting because civility has become a huge issue in the campaign for reasons that we don't need to go into, but that everyone will be familiar with. All of a sudden, the idea of ad hominem attacks on people is something that a lot of folks want to distance themselves from. They think that's not fair play. Well, my point is that for the past 10 years especially, there have been a lot of ad hominem attacks on religious people just for being religious people. So before the progressive side of the spectrum starts policing what's happening on the other side, they might want to look to their own and see what's happening there.
Mary Eberstadt, It's Dangerous to Believe is your book. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lauren.
Up next, the debate over gun control reaches a new level, and a special Jubilee audience in St. Peter's Square. It is the end of a 52-year championship drought for the Cleveland Cavaliers. LeBron James and the Cavs win the NBA Finals. They overcame a 3-1 deficit, beating the Golden State Warriors in 7 games. James, the MVP of the series, thanked the man above after winning. Cleveland is planning a parade for the team on Wednesday. It's about time the NBA playoffs end. It's the first day of summer. The summer solstice occurs this evening on the Northern Hemisphere. Hi, I'm Brian Patrick. And a 17-year-old boy was fatally shot with an assault weapon Sunday just feet from a Catholic church in Chicago. The Chicago Sun-Times reports the shooting, believed to be gang-related, happened as Mass was celebrated inside. The south and west sides of Chicago have been plagued by gang violence for years. This year has been especially violent, with 66 homicides in the month of May alone. Chicago is now on pace to far surpass last year's homicide total of just under 500. Star Parker is with Urban Cure, Center for Urban Renewal and Education. Star, this teenager was using this high-powered, high-capacity assault rifle outside of a Catholic church, taking gang violence to an entirely new level. What can be done in the face of gang violence?
Well, we need to focus attention on what really matters. We have a moral crisis in our country today. When you think about the slaughter of so many innocent inside of the womb, Brian, is it any wonder then that this wanton disregard for life and property has reached our youth, and now they're absolutely out of control, that they would be that close to a church, celebrating Mass, and just totally disregarding life itself.
We're hearing a lot about gun control in the face of terror attacks, but also gang warfare. Is gun control the answer?
We know that gun control is not the answer. In fact, Chicago has very strict gun control laws right now. And with the internet, you can get a gun anywhere if you want that. What we have to do, again, is focus our time and attention on family breakdown. And what that means, bookshelves sag with the data that connects crime to poverty to education or lack of that, and education to family life. When we start looking at what has happened, in particular in these hard-hit communities where we've concentrated poverty and most of the households have no dad there, this is what the result is.
This is where you do your work with Urban Cure. In these centers of poverty, of minority communities, how is the gun control debate playing there? Are politicians listening to what the people who are closest to this are saying?
Well, I think the politicians have their own agenda. As you notice that the left and the right constantly back and forth about should we control gun laws and do something to violate the Second Amendment in the country, and then you have those that say absolutely not, we're going to protect there. But what's happened on the ground, the people are uninformed about what is really causing this type of concentration of poverty and this type of concentration of this violence and crime. When we think about the welfare state, we have now as taxpayers put $22 trillion in a war on poverty. And as a result, we have not stopped poverty whatsoever, but we've broken family life. It is underappreciated that in the 60s, 78% of black households had husbands married to the mother of their children. Today, it's exactly the opposite. 78% of children in the black community are born outside of marriage. And that is the problem. That is the root of the problem. And many of the black leaders, including church leaders, have not reconciled that fact yet. And that's why their communities are still under attack.
You offer such a unique insight. Star Parker, thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, scientists trying to combat the Zika virus will soon begin testing an experimental vaccine in humans. The Food and Drug Administration has already approved the early-stage safety tests. Inovio Pharmaceuticals says its DNA-based vaccine tries to mimic the virus using genetically engineered materials. The company says animals tested with this vaccine developed antibodies and other cells that attack Zika. The presidential candidates celebrate the birth of more grandchildren. Hillary Clinton's daughter Chelsea just gave birth to her second child, a little boy they called Aiden. In March, Theodore James was born to Donald Trump's daughter Ivanka, her third child. For the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to leave you tonight with images from St. Peter's Square, where Pope Francis held a special Jubilee audience on Saturday. Good night. God bless you.